Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a look at a phrase you hear all the time, common sense. But what happens when that simple phrase gets turned into a powerful political weapon? Well, that's exactly what we're breaking down. So, what even is common sense? I mean, it seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? It's supposed to be all about those obvious, self-evident truths we all agree on. But, and this is the key, in the world of politics, its meaning has been totally flipped on its head. All right, let's really get into this. If you go way back to 1776, you've got Thomas Paine. He wrote a whole pamphlet called Common Sense to make the case for a pretty radical idea: revolution against the British crown. So back then, it was a tool to challenge authority. Fast forward to today, and that same tool has been completely turned around. Now, you see it being used all the time to defend tradition and to push back against big changes. Okay, so here's what we've got on the agenda. First, we're going to dig into the psychology. What makes this phrase so effective? Then we'll zoom out and see the global pattern emerge. After that, we'll ask the big question: is this all a coincidence, or is there a coordinated strategy at play? And finally, we'll look at how people are trying to counter it. All right, first up, the psychological playbook. Let's really get under the hood here and look at the mechanics of how this common sense frame works on our brains, and why it's so good at shutting down real debate. So a huge part of its power is that it acts as a cognitive shortcut. It's a mental shortcut that appeals directly to our fast, intuitive, gut-feeling kind of thinking. It takes really complex, messy problems and makes them feel incredibly simple. And when something feels simple, you don't feel the need to do the slow, hard work of actually analyzing the evidence. And because it feels so obvious, it works as a perfect conversation stopper. The underlying message is basically, hey, if you disagree with this common sense idea, you're not just wrong, you're being totally irrational. You're the one who's out of touch. It's actually a pretty brilliant way to shield an argument from any kind of real critique. So it really boils down to this simple three-step process. Step one, take a policy that's actually pretty controversial, maybe even radical, and just slap the label common sense on it. Step two, frame anyone who dares to question it as an out-of-touch elite, someone who's just spouting ideology or woke rubbish. And boom, step three, just like that, you've basically made your idea bulletproof from any genuine, evidence-based debate. Okay, so now let's look at how this playbook is actually being used out in the wild. Because, and this is important, this isn't just happening in one or two countries. We are seeing this exact same pattern play out on a global scale. Let's start in the United States. When Donald Trump was once asked for evidence to back up one of his claims, his response was dead simple: because I have common sense. See what that does? It's a way of saying that your gut instinct is more valid, more important than any pesky facts or expert opinions. Now let's hop over to Hungary. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán uses the Hungarian equivalent, józan ész, to do something very similar. He frames his government as the only one with common sense, the sole defender of reason against what he calls the madness coming out of Brussels.
And then you have Canada, where it's maybe even gone a step further. The Conservative Party there has literally branded itself as the party of common sense. They've explicitly tied the phrase to hot-button culture war issues like protecting children from radical ideology.
And get this, the data here is pretty wild. A study looked at Canadian politicians on X, formerly Twitter, and found that a whopping 95% of all mentions of common sense came from just one party, the Conservatives. I mean, that's not a coincidence. That is a highly focused, very deliberate messaging strategy. And this table just lays it all out so clearly. It really illustrates the pattern. Take a look. Doesn't matter if we're talking about the AfD in Germany, the Conservatives in Canada, or the MAGA movement in the US, the common sense frame is being applied to the exact same set of issues: immigration, climate policy, and the culture wars. It's the same playbook every time. Which, of course, brings us to the million-dollar question. Is it just a massive coincidence that all these different groups in different countries are using the exact same playbook? Or is there something a little more coordinated going on behind the scenes? Well, the research seems to point to a pretty clear channel for how these political strategies and even the specific phrases spread across borders. And it often starts in the United States with influential conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation. From there, these ideas and tactics flow to international nonprofits that have, a very specific brand. A great example is an organization literally called the Common Sense Society, or CSS for short. And what these organizations do is create a kind of talent pipeline. So the Common Sense Society, for example, hosts something called the Europa Fellowship in Hungary. And what they do is bring together these like-minded, up-and-coming professionals from all over the continent. And here's where it gets really interesting. That pipeline connects directly to powerful, state-funded ideological hubs. The Europa Fellowship is actually sponsored by the Matthias Corvinosus Collegium, or MCC, which is an institution with incredibly close ties to Viktor Orbán's government in Hungary. So you have a direct line from a US think tank right into the heart of a European government. And it's not like this is a secret either. They're not hiding it at all. You have events like CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference in Hungary, where they openly celebrate this connection. They even put out a statement saying, the revolution of American and European common sense converges in Budapest. It's right there in black and white.
Okay, so if this really is a coordinated global strategy, that leads to the next logical question, right? How in the world do you even begin to argue against something that has branded itself simply as common sense?
Well, the analysis suggests that just throwing facts at the problem, it often doesn't work. Fact-checking just doesn't get to the heart of the emotional appeal. In fact, sometimes it could even backfire, right? It just reinforces that whole us versus the out-of-touch elites narrative. What seems to be more effective are approaches that attack the frame itself. So that means things like reframing the debate to change the emotional stakes, or using satire to expose the so-called common sense idea as, well, kind of absurd and out of touch. And all of this leaves us with one last pretty crucial question to think about. We've seen how a phrase that was once a tool for revolution is now being used to defend old power structures and shut down debate. So, what is the truly common sense path forward for democracy? The sources we've looked at suggest the answer isn't just about calling out the misuse of a phrase. It's about the much harder work of building a more compelling, more inclusive, and, well, a genuinely sensible alternative.